Good evening, everybody. My name is Alfie. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, or evening, or night. Tonight, we take a step into a different era of history. We are looking at World War II tonight. Just got to change the title. As I say, tonight we take a step into World War II. Tonight I'll be reading from a book titled SAS, The Great Train Raid, the most daring SAS mission of World War II. This book is by Damien Lewis, and I've been dying to do an episode, or a few episodes, reading from this and sort of talking my point of view on everything. I hope you all weathered the storm and made it out all okay with minimal damage to your places and things, because that was one of the worst I've ever known. But tonight we take a step back to one of the most daring missions the SAS ever knew. A mission so secret, in fact, that it wasn't until 27 years after the formation of the SAS, in 1968, the first sort of publications on this mission were ever made. It was so secret, in fact, that even in World War II, it was one of those things that you just couldn't speak about, because it was one of those operations that, should anything have fallen into Nazi hands, the tide of the war could have changed. So, without further ado, let's take a dive into the Great Train Raid. Chapter 1. Naked Lunge. The training camp was desperately barren and inhospitable of a place at the best of times. But right now, in the dying days of the summer 1943, it felt blisteringly hot and suffocatingly humid, as the fierce African sun beat down and the dust mingled with the clouds of whining mosquitoes. But that wasn't what most bothered the small body of elite warriors who had gathered to hear their mission orders. It was how the briefing had ended and just what might signify for their chances of survival. Captain Eric Bill Barkworth, the highly regarded intelligence officer for the Special Air Service, had laid out the specifics of the coming operation, at the end of which the red-haired Lieutenant Anthony Greville Bell, one of the few officers present, had pointed out the obvious. Barkworth had made no mention of how they were to get home again, once they parachuted deep behind enemy lines to cause untold havoc and mayhem. "What about getting back?" Greville Bell asked, pointedly. To those gathered, it seemed an entirely reasonable question, while several of their previous missions had been nigh on suicidal. At least they had fast motor torpedo boats, or stealthy submarines standing by ready to pull them out of enemy territory and spirit them back to the Allied lines. So what was the plan for the coming mission? What was the exit strategy? How were they supposed to make it home? "That's up to you," Barkworth replied. On one level, the casual-seeming response didn't exactly surprise those present. Lieutenant Colonel William Bill Sterling's 2 SAS, the 2nd Special Air Service Regiment, modelled upon the original SAS founded by his brother David Sterling, nothing was viewed as being impossible. Nothing was deemed as being too much to ask of the men. nor beyond the boundaries of the human spirit or the capabilities of such finely honed and seasoned operators. That was especially so right then. For Bill Sterling's intention was to deploy scores of such raiding parties far behind the lines as Allied forces endeavoured to crowbar open fascist and Nazi Europe's fearsome defences. These 13 men were the forerunners, their mission to be proof of concept. If they could pull it off, Bill Sterling would have shown that his notion of mass small-scale raids designed to paralyse the enemy's supply lines and had real promise, and even might turn the tide of the war. In short, this mission might earn Bill Sterling the blessing to ensure that the SAS would be used as he intended, something that was far from being a given, as the Allies prepared to make their first landings on European shores. Still, as one of those present would remark, regarding the lack of any getaway plan, in other words, after completing the mission we would be on our own. That man, Sergeant Horace Stokes, was no shrinking violent. Having volunteered for the army at the outbreak of the war at age 18, Stokes had missed out on the battle for France and the miraculous rescue of so many from the Dunkirk beaches, losing several close friends in the fighting. He'd hungered to hit back. He volunteered for special service, for hazardous duties of a top-secret nature, and despite the fact that barracks rumour had it that these were to be suicide squads, he'd gone on to train with No. 12 Commando, taking part in a string of raids, including the daring attack on the oil tanks of the Lofoten Islands in northern Norway, codenamed Operation Claymore. Stokes had found his natural home in the Commandos, where there he was as little bullshit as possible in the ranks. A city boy upbringing, he'd learned to stalk with a deer with a knife, bloody hard, and to operate at night until darkness was our daylight. As an added blessing, his commanding officer, Captain Philip Hugh Pickney, turned out to be one of the finest officers of the war. Pickney had taken the all-for-one egalitarian nature of 12 Commando to new heights, allowing the men to dress as they liked to suit the conditions they were facing, flagrantly disobeying orders to the contrary. Such matters, he argued, were a man's personal concern. His patrol, thus quietly garbed, attracted the disapproval of every passing general. But Pickney had basked in sheer delight of disobeying an order which he considered unreasonable. During the Lofoten raid, Pickney had taken a very dim view of propaganda film being shot of the Norwegian villagers welcoming the British raiders. If it was a broadcast in Britain, they would shortly pay the price of Nazi reprisals, he reasoned. His answer was to grab the reels of film and throw them into the sea during the voyage home. For this, Pickney had faced a court-martial. Utterly unrepentant, he'd argued his case forcefully and had been let off with a fine of just £75. Even that he had contested vociferously. During another operation, a July 1941 raid on German positions at the Calais coastline, Pickney had been obliged to storm a machine gun post to stop it from sinking the landing craft that he had dropped his men ashore. Encouraged afterwards to put the key individuals forward for medals, Pickney had proceeded to recommend every man for a decoration, arguing that all had shared the same level of risk. Such an egalitarian attitude hadn't always won him friends in high places, but Pickney was a fierce champion of those under his command, and utterly single-minded in his convictions. A recent episode at their SAS training camp illustrated this attitude perfectly. His hatred of all the bad, petty side of soldiering. Pickney, Stokes and their troop had just returned from a tough sojourn in the desert, looking like a ragtag lot, only to discover that the so-called discipline was to be tightened. A recent influx of officer trainees hailing from Pucker Guards regiments had infused the place with their characteristic sense of how things ought to be done, including a distinct smartening of dress. Previously, it had been accepted that seasoned SAS veterans returning from punishing missions needed to relax as they saw fit, dressing in shorts and little else. Abhorring the pointlessness of spit and polish soldiering, Pickney didn't dress particularly differently from his men, reflecting the ethos of the SAS, which was founded on the basis of merit above all rank. But the incoming recruits seemed to find the SAS captain's eccentric appearance most irregular. Orders were duly posted that all those dining in the officers' mess were to dress formally. For most, the idea of having to sweat your way into proper dress to sit stickily at dinner was no idea of fun. Pickney was singled out for a private word and asked whether he wouldn't mind wearing a tie to dinner. By way of response, he told his men to tactically conceal themselves outside the officers' mess to provide him with a little useful cover. Stokes and his fellows had duly obliged, eyeing the officers as they arrived in all their finery. Shortly, the tables were filling up, and there was still no sign of Captain Pickney. Eventually, when everybody seemed to be seated, a figure emerged from the night, stark bollock naked, apart from a tie. In that manner, Pickney had strolled into the officers' mess and proceeded to take one of the few empty seats. There was a long moment of stunned silence before the place erupted into laughter. Pickney had proceeded to dine just as he was. The next day, fresh orders were issued, excusing Captain Pickney from having to dress for dinner. A point had been made, and in a manner that typified the man. Pickney believed passionately that he was fighting to defeat the forces of fascism and Nazism, but in his defence of Britain and the civilised world, he had a certain dark conviction that he owed to his country to be killed. As Sergeant Stokes was painfully aware, even prior to their present missions, all was not well with their commander, for Pickney had fractured his spine during a previous jump. He had confided only in Stokes, who was sworn to secrecy, and especially since Bill Sterling would have grounded the SAS captain had he found out about the injury. By fair means or foul, Stokes had managed to procure some painkillers and ointment for Pickney, but even so was he in agony. Remaining stoically silent, he had insisted on leading their present mission. The SAS medic had got wind of Pickney's injury and tried to stop him from deploying, but he was having none of it. Instead, he persuaded the doctor to apply a spray-on, freezing mixture to kill the pain. But worryingly, Operation Speedwell, as their mission was codenamed, seemed to have the indomitable Pickney rattled. He had a certain premonition of his own death, which proved deeply unsettling to anyone who sensed it. It tended to rub off, as Stokes would remark. I knew in my heart that the next operation was likely to be my last. With departure looming, the lack of any escape plan was dealt with in typical fashion, devil-may-care humour. Takeoff was to be from Krouan Air Base in northern Tunisia, a few hours' drive from the SAS camp. The 13 men had gathered, decked out in their US Army overalls, a makeshift parachuting jumpsuit, plus their fighting knives and American M1 carbines, the lightweight semi-automatic rifle then favoured by the SAS. Breaking down into their 2 sticks, there was time to kill before mounting up the aircraft, which would fly them almost 1,000 kilometres to the drop zone. Bill Sterling joined Pickney's party as they spread out one of their parachutes to form a DIY card table. Gambling proved high-spirited and fierce, and condemned men jousted at baccarat, the popular casino card game. Hundreds of pounds changed hands. The second Speedwell stick was commanded by Captain Pat Dudgeon, another long-standing veteran of the unit. He and his men passed around a bottle of whiskey as they traded stories about the respective merits of Italian wine and women, amid laughter and wisecracks. Takeoff was scheduled for 6:30 p.m. and the evening was fine and clear. Perfect flying conditions. The parachutists boarded the 2 waiting Armstrong Whitworth Albemarle's light twin-engined transport aircraft. and took to the skies. The lead aeroplane was carried Pinckney's stick, and it struck a course north across the Mediterranean for the 5-hour flight to their designated drop zone, which lay deep in Italy's rugged Apennine Mountains, some 400 kilometres due north of Rome. The twin-engine Albemarle, already obsolete, was not a popular aircraft, and as one SAS veteran would remark, for parachutists it was a death trap. With a narrow hold and a low ceiling, the last jumper sat crammed up next to the aircraft's rear gunner, risking his parachutes getting tangled with the belts of ammunition. The jump itself took place through an aperture set in the floor. A trapdoor. What a hole. Getting free of an Albemarle was a blessing for any parachutist, for it was an awful aircraft to jump from, as Stokes himself fully appreciated. The roar of the Tim Bristol Hercules engines was deafening, and all they could do was yell the odd word to one another, through cupped hands. Most dozed, but Stokes was beset by worry, and mostly for their commanding officer. Even as they'd gone to aboard the Albemarle, Pinckney made a half-joking reference about how unsettled he was. I don't feel too good about this one, but then I always get that feeling at the start, you know, the feeling that every operation might be the last. It was so unlike Pinckney to be unnerved, and especially in view of his previous track record. Over a year earlier, in June 1942, the then Commando Captain had dreamt up an utterly audacious raid, codenamed Operation Air Thief. The plan was to land from a motor torpedo boat by canoe in northern France, to push ashore with Geoffrey Quill, an RAF test pilot, and aim to infiltrate a Luftwaffe airbase to steal a Focke-Wulf FW-190, the advanced German fighter aircraft that was wreaking havoc with the RAF. They'd sneak in at first light while the FW-190's engine was being warmed up and kill the ground staff, enabling Quill to steal the warplane and fly it back to Britain, after which Pinckney would execute an escape and evasion on foot, heading for neutral Spain. As matters transpired, Air Thief was overtaken by events. A disoriented German pilot mistakenly landed an FW-190 on British soil. It was captured and flown by Quill to RAF Farnborough for in-depth study. Typically, Pinckney was outraged that Air Thief had been so unexpectedly foiled. As Quill observed, one might have encountered him accompanying Drake's raid on Spanish treasure trains, or steering a fireship amongst the Armada anchored off Calais, with Shackleton on his epic open boat journey from Antarctica to South Georgia. His exploits became sort of a legend wherever he went. Then, in the spring of 1943, Bill Sterling had founded 2 SAS after his brother, David Sterling, had been captured on operations in North Africa. On learning of this, Pinckney had hand-picked several of his commandos and all stepped forward to volunteer for the SAS, Sergeant Stokes being top of the list. In one of their earliest actions, they'd taken a jeep to probe enemy lines, riding at the vanguard of the American forces that had landed in North Africa under Operation Torch. Their overall commander was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and a large part of the SAS mission was to demonstrate to the US high-ups how special forces should be used in war. Frustratingly, Eisenhower's headquarters staff had proved almost as suspicious of the SAS as their British counterparts, regular military commanders finding it hard to grasp the concept of these kinds of missions. In an effort to show them, Pinckney and his men had advanced across the terrain to recce seemingly deserted villages, the jeep's rapid-firing twin Vickers K machine guns at the ready. Aware of their drills and with sensors on full alert, they'd skirted the settlement, even as someone cried out a warning that they'd spotted a vehicle on the far side. Racing towards a patch of desert scrub, they'd spotted a German armoured car, the gunner of which was traversing his cannon to open fire. The weapon could make short work of their open-top jeep, which meant that speed and untold aggression were their chief allies right then. Both forces let rip at the same instant, just as the SAS intended. The enemy gunner missed their speeding jeep, while the combined firepower of half a dozen Vickers K guns tore into the armoured car, a storm of armour-piercing and incendiary rounds sparking all along its metal flanks. With the Vickers K origin ally, a weapon designed for aircraft due to its rapid rate of fire mounted on a pivot was was possible to shoot from a moving vehicle with some degree of accuracy. With its impressive rate of fire, the Jeep's combined weaponry was punching out some 6,000 rounds per minute at the enemy. But even as battle was joined, so the buildings in the village seemed to erupt with flame, as mushel flashes blazed from every window, roof and doorway. The entire place proved to be crawling with Germans, while that lone SAS Jeep was more than capable of holding its own against one armoured car. This was a whole different ballgame. The role of the SAS was not to stand and fight, but to hit and run, to gather intelligence, or to wreak sabotage, and to melt away swiftly thereafter. By now, those riding in that Jeep had discovered all they needed to know. This was a heavily defended enemy position. While the adrenaline pumping and making a decision in the split second that separates life from death, they reacted with a sharp razor-sharp senses, executing an abrupt about turn as they raced back towards friendly lines and got hit several times by enemy fire, but thankfully suffered no casualties. Their quick thinking and carefully honed drills had saved the day, and they brought back vital intelligence for the American commanders about that enemy stronghold. On another occasion, Pickney had emerged from a long stint behind the lines looking like an enormous man with a long beard, most indecently exposed in the ragged remains of his uniform and carrying a Tommy gun, but also bearing crucial intelligence. For what followed, he would be recommended for a very high American decoration. With the Allied advance stalled, Pickney had set out in a Jeep to lead US forces across enemy lines. When the track he was following petered out, he went ahead alone on foot, returning 3 days later with detailed sketches of the German frontline positions. He then volunteered to lead the Americans through those defences so as to hit the enemy from the rear. An entire US regiment was ordered to follow him. At one stage during his solo reconnaissance, he'd been lying in the undergrowth with some 20 metres from an enemy machine gun position. When the German troops started to burn the vegetation to improve their field of view, Pickney had been forced to remain absolutely motionless as the flames crackled and roared all around him, grasping a rock in either hand to beat out the fire whenever it drew too close. Stokes and Pickney had bonded on countless such missions, but in the sense theirs was an odd partnership, one that would very likely have been forged in such a unit as this at war. Pickney was descended from one of William the Conqueror's knights, and the family boasted a long line of foremost warriors, lawyers, and the likes in its ranks. Educated at St. Neots Preparatory School and Eton, one of his great-uncles had been Eton's headmaster. Moving on to Trinity College, Cambridge, Pickney had lasted barely a year before wanderlust got the better of him. He'd gone off to join his father's tea business in India. Impetuous and an intense individualist, Pickney was such a strong character nobody who knew him could ever forget him. As one of his friends would remark, crucially, he was blessed with a deep interest in people, regardless of their class, race, economic background, so long as they were the kind of people Phil liked. Stokes was clearly one such person, despite the gulf between their backgrounds. The SAS sergeant had been brought up in abject poverty and with precious little education, one of 10 children raised in a 2-bedroom terraced house. He'd grown up in the shadow of Birmingham FC, now Birmingham City football ground. He'd been sent to school sans underwear, for the family couldn't afford any. And with cardboard stuffed into the holes in his shoes, his bed was a mattress filled with straw, and his clothes were frilly written. Heavily patched hand-me-downs. His father, a factory worker, owned only the one suit, his Sunday best. Often, Stokes' mother would have to pawn it to tide the family over until payday. A bright child, often coming top of his class, Stokes was offered a place at the local grammar school, but instead was sent to work as a greengrocer's barrow boy at age 14. One of the perks of the job was to take the sacks of discarded cabbage leaves to people in posh houses to feed their pets. The few coppers he earned bolstered his meagre pay, and his family were in dire need of the money. It was hard physical labour alongside some bloody tough folk. Stokes would later describe them, but likewise it had toughened him for life. teaching him how to stick up for himself and come what may. Known as Stokey to his comrades, he'd proved an SAS stalwart. But as with all aboard that, Albemarle, he sensed what would lay before them would eclipse their previous missions. Operation Speedwell was to be their testing. Southern Italy was to be the point at which the Allies would make their first landings on Europe's shores. As all appreciated, the country was shaped like a long, thin boot. Allied invasion forces were poised to hit the toe and heel of the country, which is around 1,000 kilometres from end to end. From there, the intention was to advance up the peninsula, pushing north towards Austria and Germany itself. But Hitler had other ideas. He vowed that Italy would not fall. Once Allied troops hit the beaches, German soldiers and armoured would pour south to bolster the enemy's front lines. This was where Operation Speedwell's raiders came in. Key to rushing in those German reinforcements were the railway lines that traversed Italy and extended into the nations beyond. Pickney and his men were to parachute into the mountains around the northern Italian city of Bologna. I think I pronounced that wrong. Bologna. Charged to sabotage those key supply routes. More specifically, they were to blow up German troops and armour as the heavily laden trains passed through tunnels, with the aim of blocking those routes for as long as possible. If they could start to paralyse the nation's rail networks, that would play a pivotal role in the coming battle for Italy. If scores more such SAS raiding parties could be parachuted in on similar missions, the effects would snowball and might well change the course of the war. Italy was Winston Churchill's most vaunted soft underbelly of Europe. Success there was absolutely vital at this stage of the conflict. Bill Sterling's mass sabotage raids held real promise to deliver it. If the Speedwell raiders hit home. It was just before midnight when the lead Albemarle climbed above the mountains that marked out the drop zone. Despite his hatred of discipline, Pickney was a born leader, and all would have followed him anywhere. Several of those riding in that aircraft had been with him since first volunteering for special duties, and he enjoyed an undying loyalty from those he commanded. Typically, despite his hidden injuries, he insisted on being the first to make the jump, leading his men into whatever might await. Below, the terrain was bathed in fine moonlight, and icy mountain air rushing through the open jump hatch. The DZ was marked out by the small village of Castiglione, which lay beside a distinctive-looking lake. As he waited for the jump to switch to green for go, Stokes mentally congratulated the pilot for putting them bang on our drop zone right in time. It was an impressive feat of both navigation and of flying. Having made one pass over the drop zone, the pilot sent back a warning. There was mist at ground level, and winds were gusting to 25 miles per hour. These were borderline conditions in which to attempt the parachute drop, but no one doubted that they were going anyway. Moments later, Pickney gave his signature bellowing war cry as the light switched to green and he dropped through the hole. Unless one knew otherwise, he gave all the appearances of being in the very finest fettle. Instantly, Stokes leapt after him, plummeting into thin air. As the parachute silk snapped open and his oscillations lessened, he found that he had time to study the view. They'd been released at around 7,000 feet, but as the mountains thereabouts reared up to considerable heights, dropping from such an altitude was an absolute necessity. Above him blossomed 5 further chutes as the rest of the stick made a seemingly perfect exit. Stokes could make it everyone, Pickney included, in the clear moonlight. It looked as if they'd all made a fine drop. As he drifted lower, he studied the expanse of the lake, which stretched out like a silvery blue finger reaching far to the north. Preparing for touchdown, he felt himself being grabbed by a sudden gust of wind, as it tore at his chute, making it crack and snap like a ship's sail. Stokes sensed that he was being swept out of line. A familiar voice drifted up to him, yelling out a warning. "Watch your drift, Stokes. Watch your drift." "Yes, sir," he cried. Pickney half waved one arm to acknowledge, and Stokes reciprocated. Even with the fierce winds, Stokes figured they should land with little distance separating the two of them, which meant that linking up would be child's play. Maybe Speedwell was going to turn out like so many previous missions when they'd feared the worst but somehow made it out unscathed. Right now, things were looking up. They'd been dropped bang on the drop zone, not an enemy soldier was in sight, and the terrain appeared deserted of human habitation. Just the one isolated farmhouse that protruded from the thin cloak of ground mist, and even that betrayed not a chink of light, nor sign or life. But as Stokes dropped lower, the wind strengthened. Inexorably, it propelled him towards that isolated farmstead. Moments later, Murphy's Law, if it can go wrong, it will, came into full effect. A gust drove Stokes sideways, slamming into the farmstead's chimney. The moment he made impact, he'd sensed he'd done some real damage. The pain was horrendous, and to Stokes it felt like he'd ruptured his groin. Worse still, he came crashing to a crashing, juddering halt, hung up in his parachute, suspended from the roof of the building below. He could hear the occupants waking up, and for a moment he feared it would all end like this, dangling here, shot in my harness. Blanking his mind to the pain, Stokes grabbed his knife and cut himself free. He tumbled to the ground, cursing his injuries, before he bolted into the darkness, leaving the billowing expanse of his chute dangling from the farmhouse chimney. This was totally against all training, of course, for the first thing to do when landing in enemy territory was to bundle up your chute and bury it, along with your jump helmet, to hide all signs of your presence, but needs must. Each man knew the drill upon touching down. As quickly as possible, they were to roll up the stick. Each jumper was to remain exactly where he'd landed, so that the first man, in this case Pickney, could follow the line of the drop, locating number 2, after which they'd repeat the process until all were reunited. But as Stokes scanned the moonlit landscape, there seemed to be no sign of the SAS captain anywhere. By rights, he should be hurrying back to Stokes' position, yet the familiar figure of Pickney was nowhere to be seen. Eventually, Stokes was forced to abandon the wait and search for jumper number 3, fellow Sergeant Tim Robbie Robinson. Stokes and Robinson went way back, for they joined number 12 Commando together. Over the months that followed, the two had become inseparable. They shared an added bond in that they both revered the commander. No man I ever met in the army ever talked ill of him, Robinson would remark of Pickney. He was a man, a gentleman, an officer. A very rare combination. The only man I ever met to come near his standard was Major Appleyard. Major Geoffrey Appleyard had been another prime recruit into Bill Sterling's 2 SAS. By this stage of the war, he'd already been awarded a Distinguished Service Order, or a DSO, Military Cross, and a bar. Pickney and Appleyard had served together on many a previous raid. Appleyard was to be killed 5 days after Pickney and his men dropped into the far north of Italy, as he ushered another SAS raiding party in support of the Allied landings. The death of such a highly regarded and long experienced officer would constitute a devastating loss for the 2nd SAS. And right now, here in northern Italy, the unit was about to be struck another body blow. While Robinson had landed flat on his face, executing desperate evasive action to avoid hitting a tree, a few cuts and bruises were the most he had suffered. In turn, the 2 sergeants located Greville Bell, and his condition appeared to be almost as bad as that of Stokes. As the wind had driven him towards the lake, Greville Bell had been forced to initiate the drill for landing on water. He'd struggled out of his parachute harness until he was left hanging by his hands. That way, when he hit the lake, he would be able to swim free of the mass of entangled lines and silk. Otherwise, he might end up trapped beneath it and drown. Drifting towards the water, another gust had caught him and driven him back towards land. Moments later, Greville Bill's chute had snagged in some branches, and the forward momentum had swung him around violently, smashing him to the trunk of a tree. In the process, he'd broken several ribs and was in a great deal of pain. One by one, the men rolled up the remainder of the stick, except for Pickney. Still, there was no sign of their mission commander. One man, Corporal Pete Tommaso, had news of him. Tommaso had seen Pickney descend some 300 metres away, but on the far side of a small hill he'd slipped from view. Tommaso had heard Pickney cry out his name. He'd found that somewhat odd, for he was the fourth jumper in the stick, and Stokes and Robinson were far closer. They began to search for their missing commander, making the cry of the curlew, a large wading bird that inhabits this kind of lakeland terrain. It was the agreed call to attract each other's attention. The distinctive eerie sound, like a rising, piercing tweet, echoed around the landscape, but there was not a sniff of any response. What did it signify? Had Pickney made a bad landing? Was he stumbling around injured and disoriented in the semi-darkness? In the back of Stokes' mind was the knowledge, to which only he was privy, of Pickney's pre-existing injury. His greatest fear was the SAS captain's back had given way where he landed. Though it was against their orders, they were supposed to get away from the drop zone as quickly as possible for obvious reasons. They spent an hour scouring the landscape, but were eventually forced to give up. With Pickney missing, Greville Bell was now the senior officer. His injuries were acute, and the hour spent searching for Pickney had proved totally exhausting. To keep him warm and the others wrapped Greville Bell in one of their silk parachutes, and using that as a makeshift stretcher, they dragged him away from the drop zone. Their patrol had been dropped so far behind enemy lines that they were out of radio range of 2nd SAS headquarters in North Africa. There was no way of making contact to report what had happened. Friendly forces felt like a long way away, as Stokes remarked. In so many ways, they were on their own. Okay. That's the first chapter of that book, and so far, I rather like it. A lot of what this book details is heavily focused around, obviously, the operation of the Great Train Raid, Operation Speedwell, to be more specific, and this was one of the most top-secret SAS missions to have ever been carried out. If you have ever watched the new BBC series SAS Rogue Heroes, which is an absolutely fantastic series. Obviously, I don't think it details anything on this operation because nobody knew much about it. But what we're looking at here is sort of a greater description of many of the accounts from this particular mission. And for me, it's very interesting to look at it and to actually look in depth at what people were feeling, what they were thinking, and certainly what it would have been like at the time. It's an incredible privilege to be able to look into sort of what people were thinking, feeling, and seeing at the time, and I feel incredibly lucky to be able to. I mean, obviously, this book is free for everybody to read, but I feel so very lucky to have managed to get a copy of this because it's so far I'm finding it to be an utterly fantastic book, and as I say, this is one of those things that we need to keep obviously reiterating and talking about because we cannot lose our history. That's why I started this podcast, is to make sure that we don't lose the history that we have such a rich, copious amount of. Chapter 2, Bandit Country. While Greville Bell was in a really bad way, so too was Stokes, but he decided to keep his problems to himself, having shared out the injured SAS lieutenant's kit, and having emptied the drop-out containers of their rucksacks, weapons and explosives. The two sergeants, Stokes and Robinson, led the way. It proved tough, challenging going, for the hillside above was a mass of dense, dark trees. Finally they found a spot to lie up and await daybreak. Perhaps, come first light, there might be good news. Maybe they would locate Pickney and be reunited with their mission commander. Sunrise brought no such respite. Instead, the 6 men was forced to watch as the village below was searched end to end by a mass of enemy troops. Clearly their presence here had been reported, which was hardly surprising considering Stokes' unfortunate arrival atop of that farmhouse chimney and the distinctive calling card that he had left behind. They had to presume that they would now be hunted all the way as they endeavoured to execute their mission. With no other option, Greville Bell reorganised the patrol into 2 groups of 3. One consisted of Stokes and Robinson, plus Private Len Curtis, a man of real character and a talented footballer. The other was made up of Greville Bell, Sergeant George Babe Daniels, plus Corporal Tommaso, the latter being an invaluable asset to their team. Tommaso was a Scotsman of Italian extraction whose family owned one of Glasgow's top ice cream parlours. With his dark good looks and fashionable Ronald Coleman-style Hollywood moustache, he could easily pass as a local. Greville Bell had taken 2 doses of morphine to deaden the pain, but he was in little doubt as to his limited capabilities. He explained to the men what he had in mind, while each party was to strike out for their respective targets. Sergeant Daniels had served 3 years in a regular infantry regiment before finding his way into the unit in which he would finally feel at home. Daniels had never much fancied getting killed for some obscure reason about which he'd had very little say. By contrast, in the SAS you were obliged to use your initiative and knew exactly what your target was and why it mattered. Teams set, it was time to divide their kit. Most importantly, there was 16 pounds of plastic explosives to divide, plus a variety of detonators and fuses. All was split evenly between the patrols. After that, they turned to their meagre rations, the greatest proportion of which was consisted of 4.5 pounds of cheese. As Greville would later report, I consider the food we took to be most inappropriate and a bad choice on our part, consisting as it did of cheese, sardines, biscuits, sugar, and compote. In truth, it was the sheer paucity of supplies that would prove most debilitating. Before setting off, Greville Bell voiced his opinion on what he feared must have happened to Pickney. Disorientated in the high winds, he must have set out on the wrong bearing to roll up the stick, and in doing so had got himself lost in the hills. That was one theory. But privately, Stokes feared that Pickney had suffered a very different fate. Together, the 6 heavily laden men began their climb into the mountains. By mid-afternoon, they'd reached a point that marked the parting of the ways. They paused to shake hands and to joke about how they would meet in Rome for a boozy evening, doing their best to disguise how low their fortunes had sunk. In truth, things were pretty dire. Their highly respected mission commander was missing, his second-in-command all but incapacitated. The enemy knew the SAS were here, and they would be on the scent. The 6 raiders were bound to be pursued all the way to their targets, if even they got there, after which there was only one way to escape and evade. Somehow they'd have to cross the 800 kilometres of enemy territory that separated them from the Allied landings, and all under their own steam. To many soldiers this would have proven a daunting, perhaps crushing proposition. As it was, they were off. Sergeant Daniels leading his party west towards their target, situated around the town of Peretta amid some of the highest peaks of the Apennines, while Stokes, Robinson and Curtis headed south-east towards the stretch of rail track that linked the cities of Prato and Bologna. Though they didn't like to admit it, the 2 SAS sergeants were relieved to be shot of the wounded Greville Bell. Despite his own injuries, Stokes figured they should now be able to move at a cracking pace. He and Robinson laid out a plan. They'd travel at night till they reached the objective, and continue to do so for the escape and evasion thereafter. That decided, they found a patch of dense forest in which to lie up for the remaining hours of the day. After enjoying a handful of raisins, 2 hard biscuits and a swig of water each, they settled down to sleep. It was late afternoon on 8th of September 1943, and they reckoned that 4 nights of hard marching should bring them to their target. Come nightfall, they got moving again. As they'd feared, humping full kit over really harsh terrain made for incredibly tough going, especially since they were forced to survive on a few handfuls of food per day. But still they endured. In fact, lack of water was becoming their chief problem. They parachuted in with 2 full bottles per man, and they were forced to ration themselves piteously. While pushing themselves relentlessly, they could do without food, but proper hydration was essential. 48 hours into their journey, they stopped in the darkness before dawn, choosing a lie-up point with a clear escape routes. They awoke in the late morning of 10th of September to the faint sound of running water. A stream lay nearby. It allowed the three men to slake their thirst, after which they indulged in the luxury of a wash and a shave. As Stokes would note, it was amazing how such a small act can lift your spirits, even when done in cold water. He topped it off with the even greater luxury of a cigarette smoked in the shelter of his sleeping bag. Absolutely fantastic. In truth, the SAS sergeant was in great pain, but he reckoned he would just have to get on with it for as long as he could. Pulses quickened when they heard a train in the distance. A few hours later, they actually saw one, the locomotive threading a plume of thick smoke through the landscape. Observing the railway from their vantage point, they decided upon the best time to attack, plus their route to target. The settlement of Verino lay between them and it, so they would have to be extremely cautious. It was the early hours of 13th of September, 5 days after dropping in, when they flitted through Verino's dark outskirts. Here and there they paused, grabbing tomatoes and bunches of grapes from back gardens. As Stokes admitted, we stuffed our faces as we were bloody starving and dehydrated. Bliss. A dog barked a warning. No one seemed to pay any attention. A faint humming echoed from up ahead, where a powerhouse provided electricity to the rail line. Moments later, they were at the tracks, the steel rails polished with use, stretching into the silvery distance under the starlight. Moving along them in a well-practiced silence, they peered into the generator house itself. The lone guard seemed utterly uninterested in whatever might be going on outside. Beyond lay the target, the gaping mouth of a tunnel burrowing deep into the mountains. Using a dry riverbed as cover, they stole towards that dark horseshoe of a shadow. As Stokes noted, it was good feeling being exactly bang on target, and we stopped short and listened, ready to deal with any sentry. Luckily, this stretch of track appeared to be unguarded. The three men paused for a while longer, pressing their ears to the silky smooth surface of the rails. Not the slightest vibration from any inbound train they could detect. While Robinson and Curtis covering him, Stokes, the demolition man, crept into the tunnel entrance itself, using the feel of the rails underfoot. He let them guide him deeper into the tunnel darkness. It felt cold, and the air was dank and stale. Loosening his pack, Stokes lowered it to one side and unwrapped one of the parcels of plastic explosive. The unmistakable odour of almonds filling the air. The SAS used a type of explosive known as Nobel 808, which had the appearance of green plasticine, plus that distinctive smell. He taped the first charge to the rails. They needed 3 pounds to blow one length of track, so with 8 pounds that Stokes carried, he could afford to lay 2 such charges. Once all was set, he connected the explosive to a fog signal detonator, an ingenious invention of the Special Operations Executive, otherwise known as Churchill's Ministry for Ungentlemanly Warfare. Convinced that this war would be a total war raged on all possible fronts, Churchill had established the SOE to do all the things that are strictly forbidden in law: assassinations, bribery, corruption, blackmail, smuggling, money laundering, and more. A standard fog signal was a piece of equipment used on the railways. As the name suggested, it would be fitted to a rail to alert a train driver if a stop signal up ahead was obscured by fog. As the locomotive ran over the device, it would detonate, a sharp bang warning the driver to slow down. But the SOE had adapted the standard device so as to trigger an explosive charge lying ahead of a speeding locomotive, thus causing the train to derail. In the pitch darkness of a tunnel like this, the driver would have little chance of spying the charge. Amid such narrow confines, the derailment should cause the carriages to concertina, blocking the tunnel from floor to ceiling with a mass of twisted debris. That at least was the plan. No sooner had he set the explosive than Stokes had made a move to leave. He had no desire to linger for any longer, for obvious reasons. Rejoining his comrades, he whispered the good news: charges set. Beside the tunnel entrance lay a disused quarry, with typically sheer sides. At the top there was a thick clump of trees, perfect cover from which to observe the effects of their handiwork. 3 men had only just reached the woodland when they detected the very faint sound of a train in the distance, echoing down the tunnel. There was a locomotive approaching. Sound seemed to travel further in the stillness of the night. The train was some distance away, which gave Stokes ample time to worry about the charges he had set. But there was absolutely nothing more I could do, he noted. Either his handiwork would do the business, or he would be forced to return to the tunnel to check the explosives. Stokes kept everything crossed, as he prayed he'd done the job just right. We waited with bated breath, observed Robinson. The sound grew in intensity until the rhythmic whooshing, hissing onrush of the locomotive seemed to fill the three watchers' ears. Even as the noise of the engine reached a crescendo, there was a blinding flash which lit up the entire night sky, followed by the earth-shattering roar of the explosion, the force of which tore along the valley, echoing deafeningly from peak to peak. That intense cataclysm of sound and light was followed by a most eerie, unearthly silence, which seemed to last for an age. It was broken only by the hiss of escaping steam, occasional cries plus the groans of tortured metal. Finally, the spell seemed to break. A barked cry of alarm split the silence, followed by a sharp burst of gunfire. Moments later, all hell broke loose, as a firefighter erupted on the tracks below the trio of watching saboteurs. No one had the slightest clue as to who the enemy might be shooting at, for it certainly wasn't at any of them. Either way, they seized the opportunity to vanish, knowing their job had been done and done well. Against all odds, they had struck the very blow that they intended. As the three men slipped into the darkness and began to climb, battle raged below. Not for the first time, Stokes reflected on how many people who had been attacked tended to fire at anything, even if they didn't know what they were firing at. He decided that this was really quite funny, for the noise of gunfire and explosions only fading away as they drew further and further into the heights. Disregarding his injuries, Stokes and his two companions broke nearly every speed marching record as they strove to put distance between themselves and that tunnel. Other than the moment for their landing, this was the most dangerous time. For hours they traversed intensely challenging sound, seeking the most inhospitable terrain. Over time, Stokes began to feel his injuries, coupled with exhaustion, catching up with him. Sustaining this kind of pace over this kind of landscape was aggravating his ruptured groin, though he was yet to confess that he was carrying such an injury. It was on the 17th of September, 3 days after the attack, that the last of their rations ran out. Driven to desperation, the three fugitives began moving by daylight, and they risked using some of the cash they were carried to buy food. It was difficult for any of them to pose convincing as locals, and especially for Stokes with his shock of blonde hair. They had just had to hope that the local rural folk would take them for German troops. At one stage they managed to purchase an entire loaf of bread plus eggs and cheese, like a feast fit for a king. At another they managed to enjoy a full bath in a stream, sheltered by thick woodland, followed by a cup of tea. Sheer bliss. A week after their tunnel demolition work, the trio bumped into their first enemy troops. On a track deep in some woodland they encountered a knot of Italian soldiers. By now the fugitives had all the appearances of being wild mountain men, but they were still dressed in full uniform and were heavily armed. The Italians seemed disinclined to put up any sort of fight. In short order, they offered an explanation as to why. According to them, British and Italian troops were now supposedly the best of friends, while the raiders had been wreaking devastation in the mountains. The Italians had surrendered to the Allies, in theory at least, and they were now all on the same side. More Italian soldiers emerged from hiding. From one, the trio heard an account of the very sabotage operation that they had executed, a devastating attack on a German armoured train deep in the mountains at Verino. The three raiders exchanged knowing glances, but they were not letting on. As far as the Italians knew, they were escaped prisoners of war. That was their cover story. At every turn, the trio kept their ears open for any word of their missing commander, Captain Pickney, but no one seemed to have the slightest news, as if the SAS captain had disappeared into thin air. Two of the Italian soldiers turned out to be fellow paratroopers. One was travelling south towards his home city of Naples. He offered to take the three SAS with him by train. This struck Stokes as being somewhat ironic, especially since they had just blown up one of the main Apennine rail routes. Even so, he summed up their collective sentiments thus: bollocks, it had to be better than walking. Ditching their main weapons, packs and uniform, the three fugitives used some of their cash to purchase civilian clothes and suitcases, into which they loaded their pistols and grenades, plus some food. It was a distinctly unsettling experience heading for the nearest railway station thus attired, especially since the place was thronged with German troops. Still, they held their nerve. It was the 24th of September when they boarded a train heading south, but their luck ran out while they were well north of Rome. At all points further south, the Germans were checking travel documents, identity cards, and papers. This was the end of the lines. With the help of their paratrooper friend, they avoided the nearest checkpoint, made it to a safe house, but were forced to flee when Germans launched house-to-house searches. A series of stop-start journeys ensued, first by farmer's cart, then on foot, dodging enemy convoys. But with the air turning distinctly autumnal and the weather began to worsen, they were soaked to the skin and freezing cold in their thin civilian clothing, though they often found shelter with incredibly brave locals. Anyone caught harbouring Allied troops faced the worst. Stokes' condition deteriorated fast. Eventually he was forced to reveal to the others the extent of his injuries. Though he tried to struggle on, by the 7th of October, Stokes accepted the inevitable, telling Robertson that he couldn't continue. More to the point, he was slowing down his comrades. With immense reluctance, Robinson was forced to agree. They'd found shelter with a farmer at Fabriano, a town some 200 kilometres north of Rome. Amazingly, Stokes had covered a far greater distance than that already, but this was the end. "I'll never forget the parting," Stokes would write of the moment of farewell. "As Robbie turned to wave from the top of the valley, I think both of us thought we would never meet again. That was a hard day." As for Robinson, each time he glanced back at the sight of the ailing Stokes down in a small valley watching, was stamped ever more indelibly on his mind. Stokes, alone now apart from his farmer host, was fading fast. Without proper medical attention, he would surely die. His groin had turned septic, he was erupting in pustulous boils, and his body was giving up on him. He was also in immense pain. Staying would spell the end. He knew that Rome was the right direction of travel, and that the Vatican lay in Rome. It was neutral, and there was a chance that it might harbour and secure a fugitive such as him. He also knew that Rome boasted a long-established POW support network. Getting there was the problem. No way could he walk. A week after parting from Robinson and Curtis, Stokes decided to steal a bicycle, and he set out on a seemingly impossible journey, aiming to cycle 220 kilometres into the heart of Italy's capital city. As he would write of what followed, that journey took every ounce of my physical and mental strength. By the time he had reached Rome, he had found his way into the Vatican and tried to convince those who received him that he was an escaped Allied POW. He was at death's door. Though they doubted his bona fides, they could tell that Stokes was in dire peril. Via Vatican escape line mastermind Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, an Irish clergyman, a long-standing Vatican priest, Stokes was spirited into a Rome safe house. There, a young man was asked to operate on the ailing British soldier in an effort to save his life. That man, Dr. Milko Skovic, consented. As Stokes would later write, "I have no doubt that he saved my life. Brought back from death's door, Stokes was safe for now, but of course, in Nazi-occupied Rome, he was still a very long way from home." By now, the men of Operation Speedwell had been listed as missing in action by SAS headquarters, though it was hoped that they were making their way back to Allied lines. In a sense, their fate did little to alter the overall assessment of Speedwell's outcomes, for their chances of making it home had never been overly high. Regardless, Speedwell was judged as being an out-and-out success. Not only had Stokes' party struck home, but in a carbon copy attack so too had Greville Bells. In fact, they had blown up 3 trains in 3 separate attacks. The second Speedwell stick, commanded by Captain Dudgeon, had also hit the bullseye, derailing 2 trains in the depths of tunnel, while their numbers were too small to keep those crucial rail lines out of action forever. If the whole regiment had been used, the railway system could have been halted. As it was, Speedwell had proved Bill Sterling's thesis that small parties inserted by parachute could inflict vast amounts of damage upon the enemy at comparatively little cost. The results spoke for themselves. The trains were buried deep in the mountains, taking days of clearance, and the supply of German armour heading south was held up, disrupting their reinforcement plans. But despite such upbeat assessments, the reward for such an epic undertaking was not to be as Sterling had hoped. The commander of 2nd SAS argued that his entire regiment be used on similar missions, for they were prepared to accept rough, unreconnoitred landings, which can easily be undertaken, with advantages too obvious to mention. A force of 300 men could work over hundreds of miles in up to 140 parties, with shattering effect. Mountainous areas could be infested with small parties, which, if sufficiently numerous, will completely saturate local defences and paralyse communications. Flooding northern Italy with 2 or 3 SAS teams engaged on Speedwell-like missions held enormous promise, Sterling averred. A lot of people think war is just about killing people. It isn't. It's occupying ground, and if the enemy feels so nervous that they retreat, you've won the battle with minimum casualties. Bill Sterling was without doubt a visionary, but the commander of 2nd SAS was to be thwarted. In a bitter disappointment, his request to launch multiple such missions was stymied. Instead, senior commanders at 15th Army Group, Sterling's overall chain of command, which combined forces of the British 8th Army and the 7th United States Army, had a very different kind of mission in mind. It was not a typical SAS task and was eminently unsuited to their independent, audacious, maverick-spirited means of waging war. In many ways, Sterling and his men were about to have their wings savagely clipped, and not for the first time. The feigned esprit de corps and the core strengths of the SAS were to be largely ignored, its potential squandered, but either way, the die was cast. So, what we see here is talking of the devastation on these such missions, and obviously Bill Sterling was trying to advocate the larger scale use of the SAS on such missions in 2 or 3 man groups scattered across Italy. They were ultimately trying to disrupt supply lines, and while they succeeded at that, it was obviously at great cost. They lost, well, they didn't lose for definite 2 members, but they lost 2 members. One particularly, as we've sort of slowly discovered, would be their commanding officer, and Stokes, obviously, as well. This sort of just shows you, obviously, how close these people were to each other, and sort of the spirit that they embody as a regiment. But ultimately, I think the way this is going, and I'm really enjoying this as a read, this is detailing perfectly what the SAS are about. So, yeah, it's just one of those things that you look at it and think, wow, what a regiment. But that is unfortunately all we have time for today. The next episode of this particular part of the series is going live tomorrow. I hope you've had a fantastic time listening. Thank you so much for being here. This has been Before Dracula, World War II, the SAS. And I will see you all tomorrow.